She didn't come back for him. She came for a document. 7 months ago, she'd walked out of the most precisely organized criminal operation in the city, carrying nothing but a bus ticket, a prepaid phone she dropped in the first garbage can she passed on Bloor Street, and the beginning of a secret that hadn't shown yet. Now the secret was impossible to hide. The Uber driver went quiet when Ines gave him the address. Not nervous quiet, recognition quiet, the kind of silence that said, "I know exactly what lives at the end of that road, and I am going to drive you there because you're paying me, and then I am going to forget your face entirely." Ines didn't blame him. She sat in the back seat with her coat buttoned as high as it would go, which was, strictly speaking, not very high. The last button that still reached across her middle was the third from the top. Below that, the wool gaped open over the hard, round weight of her stomach, and no amount of strategic repositioning was going to fix that. She'd told herself the coat would cover it. She'd been lying to herself for 3 weeks about a lot of things. 32 weeks. Her midwife in Winnipeg had said, "You look like you're carrying small." Ines had said, "Great." And then she'd sat in her car in the parking lot of the clinic and stared at the steering wheel for 20 minutes, because small was relative and small was not invisible, and she had exactly one task left to do before she could disappear properly and never come back. The car stopped at the iron gate. Security was new. Well, the face was new. Young, wide-shouldered, wearing that particular expression of someone trained to project calm. His eyes moved to the Uber, then to her, then dropped for 1/2 second to the gap in her coat. His expression didn't change. It almost didn't change. "Private residence," he said. "You have an appointment." "I'm here to see Cassano." Ines said his name the way she used to say it in quarterly reports. Flat, professional, no inflection. Cassano's holdings, Cassano's accounts, Cassano's signature required on page 11. The guard's shoulders went very still. He turned away and pressed 2 fingers against his earpiece, speaking low enough that she couldn't catch the words. Ines stood in the November drizzle. It wasn't cold enough for snow yet. It was the worse kind of November, grey, damp, the kind that got into your joints and stayed. She rested her palm against the underside of her belly without thinking about it. The baby had been quiet for most of the drive. He or she still didn't know, was sitting low and heavy and probably asleep. Almost done, she thought. 1 signature. Then we leave. The gate opened. The house was a Georgian revival that Cassano had bought for the architecture and promptly filled with furniture that cost more than some people's mortgages. Ines had managed the paper trail for the renovation. She knew exactly what every room had cost. She'd spent a year knowing the price of everything in this man's life, and somehow that had not prepared her for the reality of standing on his front steps again, 7 months later, with his child pressing against her spine. Rutger was at the door. She'd forgotten how large he was. Cassano's right hand was the kind of man who took up a doorway the way furniture took up a room. Not aggressively, just inevitably. He had a face like a closed book and eyes that catalogued threats for a living. He looked at her. He looked at her stomach. The book opened just slightly. "Ines," he said her name like it was evidence. "Rutger." She grabbed the handrail and pulled herself up the steps. Her lower back was a sustained, grinding complaint. "Is he in his office?" "Ines." Rutger physically shifted into the doorway, not blocking her but not moving aside either. He was staring at her middle with the focused expression of a man running numbers he didn't like. "What?" "I have a document that needs a signature," she said. She pulled the envelope from her bag and held it up. "That's all. Move." He moved, not because he wanted to, because she looked him in the eye and waited with a patience that had exactly 2 weeks of groceries and a sublet that ended December 1st behind it. The foyer smelled like cedar and something expensive she'd never been able to identify. Her stomach rolled immediately. She'd forgotten about the smell. She'd forgotten about a lot of things. And then she'd spent 7 months remembering them in a studio apartment in Winnipeg, where the radiator clicked all night, and the upstairs neighbor had a dog that paced at 3 a.m. She hadn't forgotten Cassano. She'd just convinced herself that forgetting him was a project she was currently working on. "He's in the study," Rutger said, his voice dropping into a low, urgent register. "Ines, he thinks you're just here to sort the legal end, I know." She was already walking down the hall. "That's exactly what I am." Cassano was losing his patience with the stack of papers on his desk. Not because the terms were complicated. The terms were straightforward to the point of being suspicious. She wanted nothing. No financial settlement, no claim against the properties, no ongoing arrangement. 7 months of silence, and then a solicitor's letter asking for a clean dissolution of their private agreement. The cohabitation arrangement his lawyers had drafted 18 months ago when she'd moved in. No money, no forwarding address. Just please sign, and this ends here. He'd been sitting with the pen uncapped for 15 minutes. Lyle, his solicitor, was doing something careful with his expression in the chair across the desk. Lyle had worked for Cassano for 6 years and had developed an excellent professional instinct for when to speak and when to exist very quietly in a corner. He was currently choosing the corner. "She waived everything," Cassano said. His voice was even. He'd spent his entire adult life making his voice even. It was a practiced flatness, the same one he used with customs officers and members of parliament and men who owed him money. She walked out of this house in April with 1 bag, and 7 months later she waives everything. Legally speaking. "I don't care about legally speaking, Lyle." Lyle closed his mouth. Cassano looked at her signature at the bottom of the first page. He'd spent the first 4 months assuming she'd been taken. He'd dismantled half of his Eastern operations, looking for traces of her. His contact at the police had been no help. His contact at the border services had been no help. She'd simply stopped existing, the way people only stopped existing when they were either very dead or very deliberate. Month 5, he'd understood she'd run. He picked up the pen. The door opened. I said no interruptions. He didn't look up. The nib of the pen touched the line. "I know what you said." The pen stopped. He knew that voice. He'd heard it in empty rooms for 7 months. He'd heard it explaining EBITDA to him at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Irritated and precise, her reading glasses pushed up on her head because she'd forgotten she was wearing them. He'd heard it say, "Don't touch me. I'm working and fine 10 minutes, and then I'm going back to the spreadsheets." He looked up. Ines stood in the doorway. Her dark hair was damp from the rain. She looked tired in a specific, bone-level way that had nothing to do with a bad night's sleep. She looked like someone who had been tired for a very long time and had stopped expecting it to change. And then Cassano's gaze moved, the way it always did when something in the room didn't match his accounting, and he saw it. The pen dropped. It rolled off the edge of the desk and left a thin, blue line across the wood. Lyle turned around in his chair to see what had caused the sound, took one look at Ines standing in the doorway, and became very interested in the pattern of the rug. Cassano couldn't hear anything. The room was still perfectly quiet. The clock on the mantel, the rain against the windows, but he couldn't hear any of it over the simple, catastrophic arithmetic being done somewhere behind his sternum. She was pregnant. Not slightly, not ambiguously. She was standing in his doorway with the particular rearranged posture of a woman in her 3rd trimester, weight shifted back on her heels to balance what was in front of her, one hand resting instinctively at the base of her stomach. 7 months. He'd last seen her in April. 7 months. The silence in the room had texture. Cassano stood up without deciding to. The leather chair scraped backward with a sound like a threat. "Lyle," Cassano said. His own voice sounded distant to him, controlled by habit rather than intent. "Get out." Lyle got out. He moved around Ines with his back to the wall, briefcase pressed to his chest, and was gone before the sentence had fully finished. Ines stepped into the room and pulled the door shut behind her. The latch clicked. She looked at him across the desk with the same expression she'd used when she'd found a $300 discrepancy in the Lakeshore account. Not afraid, just waiting for someone to explain the error. I brought my copies, she said. She set the envelope on his desk. I've signed everywhere your solicitor indicated. I need your signature on page 3 and page 6. Then I'll go. Cassano came around the desk. He wasn't looking at the envelope. Whose is it? He said. Ines blinked. A flash of something moved across her face. Not hurt exactly, but the close cousin of it. Are you asking me that genuinely? She said. Or is that what you say when you already know the answer and you want someone else to say it out loud? He stopped 2 feet from her. He could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the cheap material of her coat, one size too small now and not adequately accounting for November in Toronto. Mine, he said, it came out rough. Yes. You left in April. The words came out in the wrong order, clipped and stripped of syntax. You already knew. I found out 2 weeks before I left. She held his gaze, steady and unflinching in the way she'd always been unflinching, which had been the first thing about her that had made him pay attention. I was going to tell you. I'd already started thinking about how. And then one morning I came to Cassano Holdings to finish the quarterly audit, and the building 2 doors down smelled like char, and the fire marshal was blocking off Harbour Street. She paused. The warehouse. He went very still. Your warehouse, Ines said. The one your operations manager's notes said you were supposed to be in until 2 in the afternoon. She looked at him steadily. But you weren't. That time. The fire. By October it had been resolved. Someone else's problem. The Brennan network losing interest as the territory shifted. But April had been a statement. He'd spent 3 days managing the fallout and come home with ash in his hair and a fractured rib he hadn't mentioned to anyone. She'd been sitting on the edge of the bed when he came back. She'd looked at him for a long moment and said, "Go shower." He'd thought she was being practical. I sat in my car outside the building for 45 minutes, Ines said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of something that had been rehearsed into neutrality. I did the math. I've always been good at math. She paused. A baby changes the calculation. A baby doesn't just make me a softer target, Cassano. It makes me a useful one. Your enemies aren't going to take a run at your bookkeeper. They're going to use your bookkeeper's child. He stared at her. I know what your world costs, she said quietly. I tracked the costs for 3 years. I am not, her voice caught once, barely, and then steadied. I am not raising a child inside that equation. I couldn't. Cassano looked at her stomach. He was doing the same arithmetic she'd described. He was always doing arithmetic. It was the way his mind worked. Assets versus liabilities, debts versus leverage, and every calculation came back to the same answer. His. The papers, he said. I need your signature on. He picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He tore it in half, then tore the halves again and let the pieces fall between them, and stared at the floor. Those were notarized. Sit down before you fall down, he said. He crossed the remaining distance and did what he'd been preventing himself from doing since she'd walked through the door. He placed his hands on either side of her stomach. She grabbed his wrists immediately. Cassano. Ines. His voice came out stripped of everything he usually kept in it. Just the name. Just the plain fact of her standing here in his house, in this coat that didn't close, having spent 7 months in a city he hadn't known about. Just, let me. She didn't let go of his wrists, but she stopped pulling. Beneath his left palm, something moved. A slow, deliberate roll, not a kick, but a shift. Something turning over, adjusting, making room. Cassano stopped breathing. He had been in rooms where very bad things happened, and he had not reacted the way he was reacting right now, which was hands shaking, jaw locked, eyes burning with something he was not going to name in front of her. Did you feel that? He said. Every hour, Ines said. Not flat, just careful. Rutger. He raised his voice toward the door. The door opened immediately. Rutger had clearly been standing directly on the other side of it. Call Dr. Pham. Tell her I need her here in 20 minutes with a portable unit. He paused. Tell her it's prenatal. She'll know what to bring. Cassano. Ines had gone tense again. I don't need. When did you last see a doctor? The pause that followed was its own answer. He looked at her. She looked at the floor. A slight color had come into her pale face. Not embarrassment, exactly. The particular expression of someone caught in a corner they'd built themselves. The free clinic in Winnipeg has a wait list, she said, and I wasn't using my real name. The words settled in his chest like inventory he hadn't known he was missing. She had spent 7 months in someone else's city, eating whatever the budget allowed, hiding her name from a clinic wait list, in order to keep a child safe from the consequences of knowing him. You're staying, he said. I am not staying. You have a sublet that ends December 1st and no name on the clinic register. He looked at her stomach, then back at her face. You're staying, Ines. We're going to find out if this child is healthy. Then you're going to eat something that isn't from a convenience store. Then you're going to tell me the rest of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the rain had picked up against the windows. I'm not signing anything that says I'm staying, she said finally. I'm not asking you to sign anything. He picked up the torn papers from the floor and dropped them in the waste paper basket. I'm asking you to sit down. She sat. It was less a concession than an acknowledgement that her pelvis had been aching since she'd gotten off the bus, and she was running on approximately 4 hours of sleep and a coffee she'd bought at the terminal in Barrie. Dr. Pham arrived in 17 minutes, which Cassano noted privately as adequate. She was compact and efficient, and carried herself with the brisk calm of someone who had stopped being surprised by unusual house calls years ago. She set up the portable unit in the upstairs sitting room with Ines on the settee, and Cassano standing close enough to the machine to be in the way. You can stand back, Dr. Pham said pleasantly. He didn't move. Ines lay back against the cushions, hands folded over her stomach with the deliberate stillness she used when she'd decided she was fine and was going to continue being fine regardless of what her body was doing. Dr. Pham applied the gel and pressed the transducer to her skin, and the screen resolved from static into something small and curved and unmistakable, a spine, a rib cage, the blurred sideways profile of a face. Then the sound. Whump, 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 whump. Fast and even and strong, like something that knew exactly what it was doing. Cassano put his hand on the back of the settee. He did this because the alternative was standing in the middle of the room, making a fool of himself in front of his own physician. Heart rate is excellent, Dr. Pham said, with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely liked this part of her job. 143 beats per minute. Fluid looks good. Head's already engaged. This baby is getting ready. She shifted the wand slowly. Measurements are consistent with 33 weeks. Mother is underweight and her blood pressure is lower than I'd like, but the baby is thriving, taking exactly what it needs. Cassano lowered himself to one knee beside the settee. He wasn't thinking about it. His body made the decision before his mind caught up. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers lightly to Ines's stomach, just below where the transducer rested. He could feel the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her shirt. He could feel the weight of the child, this improbable person who had been existing in a Winnipeg apartment all autumn without him. Boy or girl? The question came out quieter than he intended. Ines was looking at the ceiling. Her eyes were very bright. I told them not to tell me, she said. In Winnipeg, I thought. She stopped. You thought if you didn't name it, it would be easier to protect, he said. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Leave it, Cassano said to Dr. Pham. Don't tell us. He stayed kneeling beside the settee long after Dr. Pham had packed the machine away, his hand resting against Ines's stomach, not speaking, cataloguing the small movements of a child who did not yet know what world they were being born into. By the second morning, Ines had established 2 facts. The guest room was warmer than anything she'd slept in since April, and she was not, under any reasonable interpretation of the arrangement, a prisoner. She repeated this to herself whenever she stood at the window and watched the security rotation in the driveway below. It was on the second evening, when she'd come downstairs because she couldn't sleep, and the baby had apparently decided midnight was an ideal time for acrobatics, that she heard voices from the study. She stood in the hallway. "The Brennan network has been circling the East End for 3 weeks, Rutger was saying. They know the Lakeshore accounts are restructuring. They'll read it as vulnerability. Then we don't restructure publicly." Cassano's voice, the other version of it, the one that existed at this hour, stripped of the careful management. Move the assets through the Niagara holdings, nothing visible for 60 days. And if they push anyway, then we remind them what happened the last time someone made a move on the harbor. Ines was very still. She had spent 3 years managing the paper trails of conversations exactly like this one. She knew what remind them meant. She knew what it cost. She knew with the absolute precision of someone who had tracked every dollar in and out of Cassano's operation exactly what kind of ledger entry that produced. She pushed off the wall and walked into the study. Rutger's hand moved to his holster on reflex, then stopped when he recognized her. He had the expression of a man who was professionally very dangerous and personally very unsettled, which in Ines's experience was the most honest version of Rutger there was. Cassano turned from the window. The tension in his shoulders rearranged itself the moment he saw her. Not dissolving, but shifting into something different. "You should be asleep," he said. "I was hungry." She crossed to the armchair and lowered herself into it with the careful engineering required when your center of gravity had been relocated 3 months ago and hadn't returned. She looked at Rutger. "Whatever you're planning with the Brennan network, don't move on them first. They're looking for an excuse to escalate. You make the first move, the other families read it as panic. You wait them out and they overextend inside 6 weeks. Rutger stared at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "She's not wrong," he said finally to Cassano. "She's never wrong about numbers," Cassano said. He looked at her from across the room. "She's occasionally wrong about other things." Ines met his eyes calmly. "I was right about you," she said. "I just hadn't finished accounting for all the variables." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, the nearest approximation in a man who'd largely retired from smiling as a regular practice. The photograph arrived on the 3rd morning. Rutger set it on the desk without speaking. Cassano went very still when he saw it. Then he turned it so Ines could see. It was her, taken from an elevated angle, a neighboring property, or a tree, showing her standing at the gate in profile 3 days ago, her coat open over her stomach, the manila envelope in her hand, the date and time stamped in the corner. 4 words written in marker at the bottom, "Careful with the cargo." The Brennan network. Ines felt the cold move through her the way November cold did, not sharp, just relentless and patient. "They were watching when I arrived," she said. "They were watching before you arrived." Cassano's voice had dropped to its lowest register. He was looking at the photograph the way he looked at balance sheets that didn't reconcile. "This isn't a move. This is a message. They want me to know they know." "That's worse," Ines said. "Yes." He looked up at her. "I need you to go to the lower level." The panic room. She'd revised the security budget for it 2 years ago. She knew exactly how thick the door was. "For tonight, until we understand what they're planning." He watched her face. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying on the property." She looked at the photograph. She looked at her own profile in it. The unmistakable curve of her stomach, already known by people who wished them harm. She had run 7 months ago to prevent exactly this moment. She had walked back through his front gate and handed them the information herself, wrapped in a wool coat that didn't button. "Okay," she said. The panic room was below the house, behind a biometric door off the wine cellar. It had a cot, emergency rations, a water supply, and fluorescent lighting that made everything look like a passport office. She had been in it for just over an hour when the first contraction came. She'd been dismissing the low pressure across her back for most of the evening as stress, which was reasonable, because there was a great deal of stress to be attributed. But when the second one arrived 11 minutes later, and the third one 8 minutes after that, and the fourth one 6, she stopped attributing it to anything but what it was. 32 weeks. She was not supposed to be having this particular conversation with herself for another 8 weeks. She pressed the intercom. "Rutger, I need you to call Dr. Pham." A pause. Then, with the carefully measured calm of a man not permitting himself to react, "She's already en route. Cassano called her 40 minutes ago." Ines sat with that for a moment. Of course he had. "Contractions?" Rutger asked. 6 minutes apart. Closer. She breathed through one, long, steady, the way the Winnipeg midwife had shown her in the one appointment she'd managed to attend, getting shorter. "Dr. Pham is 8 minutes out. Stay on the line with me." She stayed on the line. She gripped the cot frame when the contractions came and breathed through her nose when they passed, and she thought about the spreadsheets she'd made in Winnipeg. Budget, single parent, 1 child, pediatric costs, school catchment areas, all that careful planning, all those columns she'd filled in alone at a kitchen table with a second-hand laptop. And here she was. The intercom crackled, Cassano's voice close. "I'm at the door." She crossed the room and put her palm to the manual release. The hydraulic locks disengaged with a low, pressurized groan. The door swung outward. He was there in the same clothes she'd seen him in 2 hours ago, no jacket, sleeves pushed to the elbow. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the contraction that arrived at that exact moment was not a small one. She grabbed his arm. He was completely steady. He had always been steady in rooms where steadiness was the rarest thing available. "Dr. Pham," she managed. 6 minutes out. She's fast. He got her back to the cot. He pulled the desk chair from the corner and sat directly beside her, close enough that she could reach him without having to think about it. "Tell me what you need." "I need you to stop looking at me like you're calculating something." A brief pause. "I'm not calculating anything," he said. "I'm just here." She believed him. That was the part that surprised her. Dr. Pham arrived in 5 minutes and 40 seconds. She came through the door with a delivery kit, and the particular composure of a woman who had been quietly preparing for this possibility since the moment Cassano had called her 3 days ago. She was calm and thorough, and said, "You're doing brilliantly," with a frequency that began to feel true somewhere around the 6th time. Cassano stayed. He held her hand when she needed something to hold. He didn't try to manage it or contain it or translate it into something controllable. He was simply present, entirely, uncharacteristically, uselessly present, while Ines did the most demanding work of her life, and the baby made every decision about the timing herself. At 7 minutes past 2 in the morning, in a concrete room below a house in Toronto, a very small and furiously unhappy person arrived with a cry that rang off the reinforced walls and went straight through Ines's chest like a current she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. Dr. Pham placed her on Ines's chest, wrapped and warm, and Ines pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head, impossibly soft, faintly damp, and felt 7 months of arithmetic dissolve into something that had no formula and no column. Cassano sat on the edge of the cot. He was looking at the two of them with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 3 years. Not the controlled assessment she'd catalogued across hundreds of hours of meetings, not the careful flatness, not the version of him that ran numbers on everything in the room. Just this, just his daughter, small and warm and breathing. "I'm sorry," Ines said. She hadn't planned to say it, for the 7 months. "The math was sound," he said. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, one finger, careful, like something he wasn't entirely sure he had permission to do. The tiny fist closed around it without hesitation. "You weren't wrong about any of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You just forgot to factor yourself into the equation." She looked at him. "You ran to protect the baby," he said. "Who was protecting you?" She didn't have an answer. She'd been so focused on the liability column that she'd missed the most obvious entry in the ledger. "I'm not leaving again," she said. It wasn't a surrender. It was an accounting, a line drawn at the bottom of a very long page. But if you let the war near her— "I know," he said. He met her eyes across the top of their daughter's head. "I won't." 3 weeks later, Dr. Pham cleared them both. The baby was small but gaining weight with an efficiency that Dr. Pham called remarkable, and that Cassano received the way he received most positive assessments, with a nod and an immediate follow-up question about what else needed to be done. The nursery they moved her into was not bulletproofed. Ines had won that argument by presenting a cost-benefit analysis of early childhood stress responses that left Cassano without a counterposition for the first time in their acquaintance. He'd called it a draw, she'd called it a victory, and entered it in the ledger she kept of such things, where it sat at the top of a new column she hadn't had a name for before, the one that was starting, slowly and without fanfare, to balance.